Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about Hezbollah and the beeper attack heard around the world. Let's get started. It is a beautiful sunny day in Lebanon when all of a sudden explosions are heard across the country. I'm sure you have heard by now the incredible attack by the IDF and the Mossad against one of their enemies that has been shooting at them nonstop since the beginning of this war in October. But what we heard this past week is that the IDF was shifting their plans in order to now start aiming in the north against Lebanon. And despite a number of very targeted attacks over the last few months, we sort of have seen this stalemate, this back and forth, but nothing really happening until this past week, when, shockingly and miraculously, the IDF pulled off what might be called one of the best pieces of spycraft and counterinsurgency in world history. Many of you probably have heard of the thousands of pagers that blew up, and then the following day, hundreds of walkie-talkies that blew up in the hands and the pockets of Hezbollah terrorists. Obviously, being international spy world kind of stuff, we don't really know what happened. Israel will never tell us what they actually did. But as the story is unfolding, it seems like somehow the IDF and the Mossad might have infiltrated the supply chain of a terrorist group, which is nothing short of unbelievable. The stories that are being reported now seem to be suggesting that at the start of this conflict around October 7th of last year, Hezbollah was very nervous about using cell phones, knowing that, of course, IDF has technology to listen in on cell phone calls, possibly even target cell phone calls, because they know how easy it is to hack a cell phone and turn on the microphone in order to turn it into a listening device. So when Hezbollah started this war, they got a little nervous about using their cell phones. According to reports, Nasrallah himself said, "We need to get rid of these cell phones. They're too dangerous," which is very ironic. So apparently they went out looking for an old-fashioned technology, one that's less easy to hack, one that doesn't have microphones built in and things like that. So they went and found some beepers. Wasn't too difficult to find, I'm sure. People still make beepers for emergency situations. But what is most incredible is the fact that reports are suggesting the IDF and the Mossad somehow infiltrated the supply line where they were the ones who were selling the pagers directly to Hezbollah. Some reports suggest that they ordered, at one time, over 200,000 pagers. Now you have to say to yourself, how many terrorists are there in Hezbollah? Apparently a lot. So suggestions are that the IDF and the Mossad built these pagers, but these pagers were different because they installed a small amount of plastic explosives into the pagers. And I guess when the time was right, depending on when Israel decided, they would simultaneously send a signal to all of these pagers and have them explode all at the same time. Essentially, they know that anybody who received a pager from the Hezbollah head office is obviously an active member. These pagers would be calling them for meetings, telling them where and when to go to their missile sites to shoot off their rockets. So you wouldn't be a regular person with this pager. Reports have been saying that thousands of people have been hurt in this massive attack by the IDF. But the most incredible thing we heard is how many people who weren't officially Hezbollah members who had pagers that blew up. For example, the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. Why he has a Hezbollah-made pager, I guess you can decide for yourself. There were other Syrian nationals that were affected by these pagers. Again, why Syrian officials have Hezbollah pagers, you can decide for yourself. But this attack was unreal. And not only did it have the positive effect of harming terrorists so they can no longer be terrorists, but the psychological warfare that we've seen is just unbelievable. The Hezbollah people apparently had a huge bonfire throwing in all of their electronics that they could no longer trust. Think about also the chaos that it creates of not knowing who was involved in this plan that the Israelis had. Someone obviously had to be on the inside, knowingly or unknowingly. Who's the spy? This attack was unprecedented and a huge success. But unfortunately, when it comes to Israel, probably only Israel, a huge success doesn't mean it comes without criticism, because Israel is wrong for pretty much everything they do. Israel would be wrong simply for existing at this point. Many people came out on Twitter, or X as it's now called, in the media. Many American politicians who are known to be anti-Semitic and anti-Israel came out detesting this disgusting display of attacks on a terrorist group. We heard the constant crying about all the quote-unquote innocent people. Now, again, as I said earlier, these were Hezbollah purchased and Hezbollah distributed pagers. If you had one, you would have to be an active member of Hezbollah. So is it possible that maybe someone who's in Hezbollah happened to give their pager to their child to play with? Sure, it's possible. We do know of one case where apparently a Hezbollah member left his pager behind, and his child apparently went to go pick it up when she heard the page come in, and unfortunately was harmed. And that is an unfortunate situation. But with 3,000 explosions and only one or two people who might have been accidentally harmed, I think that's a success. But the cries of how so many innocent people are harmed is really sad, because you can't get more pinpoint than this. They complain so often about everything we do. And the irony, of course, is that they don't care about the Israelis who are under months of rocket fire. That's not important. But maybe someone accidentally being hurt in a pinpoint strike, that's something we have to talk about endlessly. If you watch the videos, and there are a lot of them, but you can see the explosions are relatively small. Considering how small a pager is, they didn't have a lot of force. In one case, you could see a video of a man at a cash register paying for whatever he bought, and he blew up, and the person who was taking his money less than 3 feet away was completely fine. These were not massive explosions. They literally only did damage to somebody who was wearing or holding the pager. So the cries against Israel about how terrible this is are pretty much silly. Online, I saw an amazing quote by influencer Hen Mazig. He pointed out that the world cries foul when the Israelis drop bombs from the air and kill terrorists. He then points out that the world criticizes us when we send our troops in and we put their lives at risk in order to minimize casualties and only get the people we want. And now we see that they're criticizing us for the most possible pinpoint strike ever to happen in history, and yet still criticized. He points out that maybe the fact that we are doing it in certain ways is not the problem here. The problem that people have is simply that Israel is defending themselves in any way. I don't care how you do it. There's literally no standard you could do in order to make it valid to defend yourself. So just stop defending yourself in any way. Many of my listeners probably have heard about Hezbollah for many, many years. We haven't talked about it as much on this podcast as I would like to, mainly because we've been focusing on the other side of the country, on Hamas and what they've been up to. But I thought that this recent incident is a great excuse to talk about Hezbollah, something we haven't really brushed on. So we're going to go a little bit into the history of this group, how we got to where we are today, as we always do on this podcast, to give you the context and understanding of what's been going on. Funny enough, Hezbollah and its creation has something to do with the Palestinian Arabs. I've mentioned on this podcast before some of the history of the Palestinian Arabs and their terrorism, and I talked a little bit about how in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the terrorism that was happening by the Palestinian Liberation Organization was happening against the country of Jordan. For a very long time, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was focusing their attacks mostly on the country of Jordan, those who actually were oppressing them, and still do to this day. This led all the way up to things like the Black September, where the Jordanian army massacred Palestinian Arabs all over the country. In 1971, in an agreement between the Jordanians, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the Arab League, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was kicked out of the country of Jordan. And where did they go? They went to Lebanon, where they essentially did the exact same thing. They started all kinds of problems within the country of Lebanon. If you remember from some of our old podcasts, I talked about the fact that almost every single country in the region, other than Israel, has Palestinian Arab refugee camps set up by those very countries in 1948. So when the Palestinian Liberation Organization made their way to Lebanon, sure enough, they recruited and continued their reign of terror in those refugee camps that were already set up, already filled with Palestinian Arabs, many of which very angry at their mistreatment by the Lebanese. So therefore, they destabilized Lebanon. And this led to a lot of internal fighting amongst the Palestinian Arabs and many of the other people in Lebanon. But they also started doing terrorism against Israel, and therefore Israel got involved. And in the 1980s, there was a war essentially between the Palestinian Arabs in Lebanon, who were attacking Israel, and the state of Israel, which brought the country of Lebanon, who really didn't want to fight with Israel, into a war, unintentionally, because the Palestinian Arabs in their area were acting hostile against their neighbor. Sounds a little bit like right now, doesn't it? One very unfortunate fact of history lends Lebanon to be more susceptible to these types of issues. The issues of Hezbollah right now and the Palestinian Liberation Organization taking over a country and holding it hostage. Many of my listeners may not realize that the country of Lebanon was a mandate of the French. Much like we talk about the British Mandate of Palestine, Lebanon was the mandate of France. So the French set up their country, and it was a colony for many years, until they eventually gave it independence, and they set up the Lebanese constitution. Unfortunately for the Lebanese, when the French did this, they took into account the various groups of people who lived in Lebanon. At that time, it was a mix of Sunni and Shia Muslims and Christians. There's also Druze and a bunch of other different people there, but they didn't get a seat at the table because they're not a big enough group. So when the constitution and the government was formed, the French decided a smart way to do this would be to create a government system that allowed all three to have equal power, which in theory sounds like a great idea. But the problem is, in practice, it completely crippled the country. When the French set up the government, they said that a president has to be a Christian, the Speaker of the Parliament has to be a Shia Muslim, and the Prime Minister has to be a Sunni Muslim. And unfortunately, because of this equal power, if people aren't getting along and people don't want to agree on policies and things of that nature, nothing ever gets done. And it also lends, unfortunately, itself to being hijacked. If people aren't allowed to vote in the best person for the job and are forced to pick the best of a certain group that may have alternative ideas that don't go along with the rest of the country, this is a recipe for disaster. So in the 1980s, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was in war with Israel, the government sort of didn't really function. It was pulled into this war and really had nothing to say or do about the whole thing. Following the war in the 1980s, we saw sort of a vacuum left behind. The PLO was kicked out of Lebanon and sent to Tunis, Tunisia. There were incidents of horrible violence by the Christians against the Muslims in the country, and the country was sort of in complete chaos. And this is when a group called Hezbollah comes into power. Hezbollah was an attempt to do what Iran had done in their country in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Hezbollah came along and tried to have their own Shia revolution and take over the country of Lebanon with all the chaos that was happening. As is the case with most of these extremist groups, they try and present themselves as this better option and a governing body that plans on helping the people, unlike the current government. And they got into politics. And because Lebanon is required to have a Shia at the top of their government, along with the other two groups, Hezbollah aimed to take that top spot, and they became representative of essentially a third of the government, and therefore could somewhat dictate policies. With the help of Iran, who was very happy with their type of takeover of the country and their support of the Iranian regime, they grew their power and took over pretty much all of southern Lebanon. At this point, it's really a state within a state, and the government itself and the Lebanese army has no control. Their power and ability has grown exponentially with the help of Iran, who's been supplying them with money and weapons, and having free reign in all of southern Lebanon. And this brings us to 2006, when on the 12th of July, Hezbollah fighters fired rockets at the Israeli border towns as a diversion to allow 2 armored cars to enter the Israeli side. They ambush a number of soldiers and leave them dead. 2 soldiers are captured and taken hostage into Lebanon. Hezbollah was hoping to get prisoners released in exchange for the hostages, something we had seen the Palestinians do for years. And this led to the Second Lebanese War. The fighting between Hezbollah and Israel lasted for about a month before the United Nations Security Council approved UNSCR 1701, which was an attempt to resolve the conflict. The UN agreed that they would create a buffer zone in southern Lebanon and northern Israel to stop these cross-border attacks and the rocket fire. The UN would have people in this no man's land to ensure that Hezbollah would never infiltrate or fire rockets into Israel again. In return, Israel was expected to pull their forces out of Lebanon. They had made their way all the way to Beirut and had the entire city encircled. The UN expected the Lebanese government to attempt to disarm Hezbollah, but this unfortunately never happened. As you clearly know right now, the UN didn't succeed in their mission because for months before October 7th, it was very well known that Hezbollah was breaking this rule and the UN was saying and doing nothing about it. The UN pretty much allowed them to break that UN resolution and enter the area they weren't supposed to be in. And then as of October 7th and then 8th, they started firing rockets from that area. And we've seen nonstop rocket fire ever since. Some people had a little bit of hope that this UN resolution following the 2006 conflict would quiet the northern border down. Unfortunately, in 2006 to 2008, Hezbollah became even stronger within the Lebanese government, and they created a coalition with the other parties to be officially recognized as part of the government. It's been a long time since 2006, and Hezbollah has not waited or stopped trying to arm itself and prepare for the next attack against Israel. They may take a pause for a while, but their goals are very much clear, and they have no intention of stopping. Any type of pause or ceasefire or UN resolution just means they're going to wait until they can refuel themselves for the next battle. And that's what they've been doing for 20 years. In fact, recently we heard in the news, as part of the Israeli plan to take out terrorists in Hezbollah, they have been targeting what they call the Radwan force. This Radwan force is the Hezbollah version of October 7th. They had been planning and they've been preparing this force to do what October 7th was, but from the north. And Israel recently has taken out a whole bunch of this Radwan force, including their commanders, in order to ensure that this could never happen in the north. In the end, we see the escalation, as they love to call it, in the north. Of course, the media will tell you that Israel is escalating. We've talked about that before in the podcast, which is ridiculous. But we have also seen the fact that people who are aiming to harm Israel through rocket fire, through an October 7th-like attack, have been slowly and meticulously taken out by the Israelis. The Israelis are not going to sit back and wait for the next October 7th from the north. They are not going to continue to allow thousands of rockets to be fired on Israel without anything in return. Israel has been doing many things behind the scenes, clearly with the pager attack, or even overtly, like the hundreds of strikes against rocket facilities in Lebanon. To date, Israel says they've killed over 500 commanders in Hezbollah, including much of its main leadership, everyone except for Nasrallah. But the challenge that Israel faces is the fact that the Lebanese government isn't stopping Hezbollah. The UN is not stopping Hezbollah. Lord knows the media is sure as heck not holding them to account, and everybody is crying for them when they get hurt while trying to be terrorists with beepers to tell them when to go and attack Israel. So who is holding Hezbollah accountable? It even appears that America's only plan for Hezbollah is to make a deal with Hamas and hope that Hezbollah just randomly gives up their attempt to kill the Israeli state. I don't think I've even heard them ask Hezbollah to stop firing rockets. Just think about the fact that they have been firing rockets at civilian populations for 11 months, and no one is even talking about it on the news. And the only time it's mentioned is when Israel strikes back to say Israel's wrong for doing it. We saw Lebanon kill 12 Druze children, and the world barely even cared about it. As the defense ministry has said, the focus of this war has now shifted. It has shifted from the south in hitting Hamas targets to now taking on Hezbollah, finally, straight on. And we've seen this happen before. You could see that this isn't the first time that the Lebanese border has gotten a little bit chaotic. But in the end, Israel's going to win. Israel will be able to take out these targets and make sure that the people in the north of Israel can return home. Finally, after about a year living in hotel rooms across Israel, having no sense of normalcy in their life. The world really needs to wake up to this terrorist organization posing as a government body who is attacking a neighbor sovereign nation, and nobody's even talking about it. And if the UN comes knocking, claiming, hey guys, we're going to do some sort of peace deal between the two of you, and don't worry, we're going to give you a buffer zone, like they said the last time, maybe we can be a little bit skeptical about trusting the UN to ever care about what Israel needs and what keeps Israelis safe. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.